Valkyrie Elysium is a new action RPG from Square Enix that invokes the name of the classic Valkyrie Profile franchise, which if you've never heard of or played before, the original Valkyrie Profile is really the main one that a lot of people have a lot of love for. It was a PS1 RPG that was very different from a lot of the other ones at the time. While Elysium sets out to be a very different kind of game overall, it draws a lot of inspiration from these things that made Profile great, and the resulting experience is something that is fine. Just fine. It's not a bad game by any means, just not a particularly great one either. I've had a few people ask me, and quite a few people wonder how closely Elysium is tied to Profile, and the answer is not really at all. This is an entirely different style of action RPG made by a different dev team with its own original plot that does, again, borrow a lot of clear inspirations, and some plot points are directly lifted from the older games, but ultimately it is its own standalone adventure that, if anything, you could view as being maybe a reimagining or homage to the original rather than being a new entry or sequel. And the good news about this is the fact that if you've never played a Valkyrie Profile game before and you just saw this one and thought it looked really cool and you're wondering whether or not you have to play the past ones to enjoy it, no, you don't. It stands completely fine on its own, and in some ways I think actually ends up working out a little better in that case. The potential bad news about all this though is that if you have played those older games and have a lot of love for them, depending on what exactly you want to see recaptured in a new game that uses that title, you might end up walking away disappointed. Now, I will say that for me personally, I absolutely fall into that category of someone who played the originals and loved it, and that shaded my expectations and experiences with this new one, and I didn't hate it. There was some stuff about it that I really like and thought were some great ideas, and there's other parts of it that absolutely do fall flat a little more, especially compared to the original game. First off, basic overview, Valkyrie Elysium is an action RPG much more focused on the action side than the RPG side, and the overall flow of the game is pretty simple. You get through an opening tutorial part that also sets up the basis of the story, and then you have a hub area where you'll select which quests you want to take, either main story quests that take somewhere around 45 minutes to an hour to complete that actually move the main plot forward, and then also various subquests you'll unlock along the way that take somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes to complete that are usually just a straightforward destroy a bunch of enemies taking place in the same areas you've already explored during the main chapter quests, and mainly act as a source of additional gameplay, giving you some more resources, and unlocking new weapons and abilities you can use to make later levels easier. I want to focus first on a positive aspect of the game, something that I think is one of its stronger parts really, the core combat. The general combat mechanics of the game are pretty simple and straightforward, but there is room for higher tier play if you really like experimenting with combos and doing fancier stuff, though it never really feels that required, at least on the game's normal difficulty. While you start off with one weapon that has a specific playstyle, you'll unlock more weapons as you play across the game, each that handles a little bit differently. Many of them can very simply be played down as just keep pressing the attack button to chain a combo until things are dead, but there are fancier things you can do and learn over time as you unlock higher levels of each weapon. The mechanic that really makes this game interesting though, and is really one of the main inspirations pulled from the older Valkyrie Profile series, is Einherjar. These are the soldiers that you'll be able to recruit over the course of the game that make up your party, but instead of Valkyrie Profile where it was a RPG where you had your guys set up as a little attack party, in Elysium, combat is focused entirely on what you as a Valkyrie can do, and you can summon the various Einherjar as a form of temporary support. This can be done on command where you intentionally summon a specific character because you'd find them useful for taking down certain kinds of enemies, or there are various different abilities you'll unlock over time where you'll automatically summon them when certain circumstances arrive, giving you really easy ways of quickly getting immediate support when you need it. Now, while in the older Valkyrie games you had a large cast of Einherjar that you would recruit over time and can pick and choose from, Elysium does have a much more focused approach where there are only 4 you'll get across the entire game, giving a little more chance to flesh each of them out, although maybe not quite enough. I'll talk about that a little later. But as far as combat goes, it really just focuses on having these 4 main ones that you're able to alternate and use between, and there's also a bit of an almost Pokemon aspect of this where there's a heavy emphasis on elements. Different enemies have different elemental weaknesses that you can capitalize on by using special attacks the Valkyrie knows, or you can also summon the relevant Einherjar that uses that element to immediately capitalize on that weakness and even imbue your regular attacks with the element as well. This is really the main thing that shakes up the combat, because while the core combat system does have some advanced combos and things you can learn, really the main thing you end up needing to focus on is knowing which Einherjar to summon when to use certain special arts, when to capitalize different enemy weaknesses, and balance balance out your approach to there. It can sound like a lot of mechanics all at once when being explained, but in practice in the game, it's actually all very simple and straightforward, and ultimately combat has a very satisfying, quick feeling to it. It can run a little bit into the feeling of being a bit too repetitive, but this really only starts to settle in, at least for me, near the end of the game, when you get to a point where you're just so powerful, you want to get to the end, and you keep running into enemies that you can't run away from, so you have to fight them. But until that stage, really, the combat is that right balance of simple but fun, and fights last short enough that it never got boring for me. I will say, though, that one aspect of this that did feel a little underbaked to me is the game's progression system. Basically, you can level up the Valkyrie by investing resources that you get from enemy drops, and the resources are so plentiful that you immediately buy out a bunch of upgrades all at once, and the only thing that keeps you from progressing is then needing a new kind of resource that doesn't show up until a later chapter. So you'll find yourself having these very large power boosts at the start of every new level because you finally get this new resource you didn't get yet, and you can finally upgrade all your stuff, and then you'll plateau again until the next new area. So it doesn't really ever feel like a smooth progression in power, nor does it feel like you ever really have a sense of customization or prioritization. You're just waiting to get more powerful when the game deems it's necessary. Something that ties into all this that I think is important to talk about too real quick is the visuals. Graphically, the game is not the most intense thing out there, but I think the art style really balances it out. There are some occasional visual bugs that can be a tiny bit distracting, but aren't often enough to be a real issue. I absolutely love a lot of the art direction for the game. The character designs look great, but when it comes to, keeping an action game feeling engaging, frame rate is something that is really important. And for the most part, it's really smooth, at least in my experience with the PS5 version. Earlier parts of the game rarely experience frame drops, if ever, and when they do happen, it's barely noticeable. However, late parts of the game, you can end up having some pretty noticeable frame rate drops when particular enemies spawn. There are just some enemies in the late game that have so many different visual effects going and so much special stuff happening that just can't help but be a bit too much for the system to handle, apparently. This is not frequent, thankfully, and normally when this happens, they are enemies that you can at least take down fairly quickly, and so the game smooths right back out right after, but it does take you out of the action when it happens. The camera can also be a little hectic at times. Usually when you're in the middle of a nice open area, everything will look great and smooth, but there's definitely going to be those occasions where an enemy gets you in a corner, or you're just fighting in a tight area, and the camera just isn't quite sure what to do about that, and you lose track of yourself. Thankfully, combat is simple enough that you usually fight yourself out of a corner pretty easily and then give it back. It's never that frustrating of an experience, but it is something you're definitely going to encounter more than a few times. Outside of combat, the game does have some light platforming and exploration mechanics, but it's nothing too deep. It's mostly just making sure to double check every nook and cranny to find these little collectible flowers that flesh out the game's backstory a little bit more, give a little more mood setting, stuff that I really enjoy, but it's never really a hard focus of the game where really the main thing is do a lot of combat, move on to the next area, do a lot of combat, wash, rinse, repeat. And then we get to the game's story, which for me is, I think, really the roughest part about this whole experience, especially when compared to the first one. Again, this is technically a completely new standalone story. It is not directly tied to the events of the first game, but it does lift a lot of plot points and inspiration from the first one, which I think makes it harder to not compare the two in this aspect, because you can see how the story was executed and handled in the original game, and how a similar story was executed and handled in this new one, and it just doesn't quite hit the same level. And I think the biggest problem it runs into, at least for me, is that there's just not enough of it. I mean, there's a full story here, there's a beginning, there's the middle, there's the end, there's a cast of characters, all this plays together, but it just feels a lot like an outline that's just missing a few additional baked moments to fill it out a lot more. Most of the plot happens in spurts that take place during the middle or very end of levels, and a lot of it revolves around Valkyrie's quest and gives a little bit of background and story to each of the Einherjar that you recruit over the game's story. Something I mentioned earlier was how in older games you had a much larger cast of Einherjar to work with, and some of them were, more filled out than others in terms of storytelling and plot and backstory. Whereas with Elysium, you only have the 4 to work with during the whole game, and yet despite the fact that you only have those 4, and that should mean a lot more screen time for each of them, it never really feels like any of them get the proper full shading out that they need to. There are dedicated subquests for each of them that you can follow that add a little more backstory and flesh them out more, but it still just doesn't really ever feel that cohesive. Much like the rest of the game, I don't think I would necessarily write off the whole storytelling and writing as bad. It's just not particularly strong, and it's one of the areas that can be most directly compared to how things were handled in the original game. Because obviously, changing the combat style, changing the game mechanics, a lot of that can't be directly compared because they are ultimately very different things. But when you look at writing and storytelling, well, those you can directly compare a little more. And it's just definitely the area that I think this game falls the shortest with if you're coming from that experience with older ones. When I look back at the roughly 20 hours of gameplay I put in Valkyrie Elysium, I don't regret it. The game is absolutely rough around the edges in a few different places, and there are some things that don't live up to the namesake that's being invoked here, but ultimately, it was still a fun, straightforward, albeit kind of simple, action RPG. The core building blocks here are good enough that I enjoyed my time with it. I'm just not necessarily looking to rush out and do another playthrough anytime soon, and depending on what exactly you enjoyed about older Valkyrie games or what you're looking for in a game to play, it's one I would recommend. It just isn't necessarily a high priority. If you want a relatively short and fun action RPG to play and kill some time with, Valkyrie Elysium is a great pick for that. Just don't go in expecting it to be your surprise game of the year. So those are my thoughts on Valkyrie Elysium. If you are interested in grabbing a copy of the game, I do have it linked down below in the description. As always, if you enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up button to let me know, or thumbs down if you didn't. It's good info for me to have. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Make sure to hit that notification bell so you actually see videos when they're going live, and I will see you guys later.